Thank you once again for joining Los Altos Community Coalition. I'm your host, Joe Beninado. Let me start by introducing our guest today. Michael Wara is Director of the Climate and Energy Policy Program and a Senior Research Scholar at the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment, as well as Senior Director for Policy at the Sustainability Accelerator within the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. Wara organizes and manages cross-functional teams of postdocs, legal fellows, and graduate students that provide fact-based, bipartisan, technical, and legal assistance to policymakers, environmental justice advocates, and tribes engaged in the development of novel climate and energy law and regulation. He also facilitates the connection of Stanford faculty with cutting-edge policy debates on climate, energy, and climate impacts, leveraging Stanford's energy, climate, and natural resource expertise to craft real-world solutions to these challenges. Michael, we are so happy you were able to join us today. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. And it's really great to be talking to members of what I think of as the sort of broader Stanford community. I'm going to just speak for a few minutes about some of the questions that Joe posed and show some pictures because I think, whoop, sorry, wrong picture. Let me go back here. Because I think pictures are really important in this context, especially as we're thinking about our own community. So Joe reached out and said, could it happen here, right? What about, is Los Altos vulnerable to what happened in Los Angeles? And I don't want to like hide the lead. The answer is yes. And but that being said, I think there are many lessons from Los Angeles and other recent urban firestorms that point to ways out of this problem, and that we have agency in determining the level of risk that we carry into fire season, and we have agency in really reducing the chances of outcomes like the tragedies that just occurred in LA. So I'm going to talk briefly about, could it happen here, and talk about some of the risks and some of the things that I think, Los Altos and other communities in California are experiencing. What can we do about it, and what the barriers are to actually taking action to really substantially reduce risk. So one thing to note is just that, wildfire risks are growing. And I think we all know this living in California. This is a picture of something called seasonal vapor pressure deficit. And that is a fancy way of saying what I like to call how thirsty is the atmosphere. And what you can see in this picture is that, vapor pressure deficit is really just the difference between how much water vapor the atmosphere can hold relative to what it is holding. And in general, as the temperature rises, the vapor pressure deficit increases as the square of the temperature increase. So it's a non-linear relationship to warming, and the effect of that on the environment is that water vapor evaporates more readily. That means that dead fuel, including like debris on the forest floor or in your backyard, or houses, which are dead fuel, right? They dry out. That most houses are made out of wood, and therefore they are dead trees. And they get moist in the winter, like right now, and they get dry in the fall in California. All that dead fuel dries out more readily. Live fuel, like living vegetation, is having to work much harder to stay hydrated because it tends to lose water vapor into the atmosphere more readily. And that also means that water is sucked out of the ground more readily. All that is speeding up because of climate change. And this is not to say that, we have had fires, the 1923 fire in Berkeley, for example, the 1929 fire in Marin, that have been very large and sometimes destructive. But the odds of those fires occurring is growing. Ask any wildland firefighter; they will tell you, if they have decades of experience, that this moment is different than the beginning of their career. That fire intensity has increased, the frequency of high intensity fire has increased, and that they're experiencing things that were kind of once in a decade or maybe once in a generation events every couple years at this point. And the key point here is that this is not going to stop. And the reason I put that, so this just shows the records from different measurements put on top of the gray as climate models. And what you can see is that there's obviously year-to-year variation in this. There's good years and bad years. We just had a good year in 2024. It was one of the quietest fire seasons in generations. But the frequency of the bad years is growing. And if we take the model seriously, what they tell us is that by the mid 2030s, the average year will be a lot like the worst years we've ever experienced. So we need to be getting ready. That's a key point in this talk. What we need to be doing now is preparing for the worst years we've experienced because those will become average years within about a decade. Let's see here. So I'll just say this is a picture I took at Stinson Beach on August 16th, 5 years ago. This is the lightning complex getting lit. And we've long had ignition sources like lightning busts that cause significant problems for firefighters. Um, but the consequences are really what is changing, right? Ignitions are a fact of life, either from lightning, from electric power lines, just from having 40 million people living in one place. That's a reality that we cannot get away from. If you look at maps of ignition, you see that the ignitions tend to occur where the people are, with the exception of lightning, where ignitions tend to occur on ridgetops. But it's going to be very hard to sort of take it's not quite fair to Smokey, but find the Smokey Bear way out of this problem because there are just so many people in California. Um, the LA fires, were ignited by electric infrastructure, or one of them we think was ignited by electric infrastructure. This is a picture taken by a homeowner at the base of Eaton Canyon on the night of January 7th, and you can see why we think that. But I think it's also important to recognize that the other fire in LA was started by fireworks, so far as we can tell. So we've got, it's easy to blame the utilities. They are definitely a part of the risk problem for ignitions, but it's important to understand that there are many sources of ignitions. Utilities need to do their part. We work very much on sort of evaluating and pushing utilities to do more on their own kind of risk that they create for the communities they serve. But at the same time, what we're also experiencing in California are the limits of the kind of paradigm that we adopted after 17 and 18 of really going after utilities as a core source of the problem. And I want to show one other picture of, oops, I always want to hit. There we go. This is Altadena burning later that night. And what I want you to notice here is that while we call what happened in Los Angeles the LA wildfires, that's not really wildland on fire. Those are houses burning. The wildlands are the green in the upper right corner, and you can see that they are not on fire. Houses and neighborhoods are burning, gardens are burning. So as we think about how to avoid an outcome like Los Angeles, we need to think about ignition sources, but we also need to think about the flammability of communities. It is it is the central problem that we confront. And when I think about LA, I think more about the Great Chicago Fire of the 19th century rather than a forest fire. When we think about the Great Chicago Fire, we don't blame the cow. The mythology around this, and if there are any natives of Chicago, they'll know this better than me. The mythology around this is that there was a lady called Mrs. O'Leary, and she had a cow in her barn, and the cow kicked over a lantern and started the fire in her barn that then burned down a significant portion of Chicago in a single dry winter day. Sound familiar? Dry, windy winter day, right? Um, that we don't blame the cow. We don't blame the lantern. We say, how do we engineer a built environment that will not burn? And today, in modern urbanized environments, wildfires like we experienced in Los Angeles are really just not possible. It's only in the suburban neighborhoods that they have remained possible. Think back to the Oakland Hills fire of '91, and that the frequency of these catastrophes is what we're seeing change. And that is really due to climate change, the effects I was talking about. But the solutions have only partly to do with wildland management, but a lot to do with how homes are built and maintained and how gardens especially are maintained. Um, this changing risk is having a big impact on everybody's lives, whether their homes have burned or not, whether they live in high or moderate or even low risk parts of California. This is data that we modeled in my team that just shows average premiums for insurance in California through time, and you can see that we're on a roller coaster going up. And it's our we've achieved liftoff in insurance premiums. And I'll tell you that this is unlikely to change. And this really reflects two factors. One is the price suppression that occurred prior to 2020. As the risk was changing, the insurance regulator did not allow prices to increase to reflect that risk. And so now we've kind of hit a breaking point where prices are have to rise if there's going to be available insurance. And that's what everyone is experiencing across California, especially. And these are just quintiles of risk in the highest quintile of risk. In addition, even for that highest quintile, sometimes the prices are not high enough. And so we're seeing a rapid growth in fair plan policies. This is the insurer of last resort in California. Recently, the fair plan ran short of cash, and so was allowed to assess $1 billion across all insurance policies, insurance coverers in California, 500 million of which will be picked up by everyone who has an insurance policy in California. I would just say, kind of in commentary about this, I don't think this is the last time the Fair Plan is going to need money. So essentially, we are socializing the high risk insurance across all of the policies in California. Whether that's a good idea or not is kind of beyond the scope of this talk, but that's what's happening because the risks are growing so quickly and we're pushing people into this kind of pool of very high risk properties. This just shows fair plan policy concentration in California. You can see the Sierra is a big part of the risk, but you can also see that there's some hot spots down in the South Bay and in the Santa Cruz Mountains that are quite important. Obviously, North Bay is also a big deal. So what can we do about it? I think it's really important to focus on this and focus on the agency that we have. This is a picture, satellite image. You can see Lake Tahoe in the top, Fallen Leaf Lake. Great places to visit if you've never been there. Fallen Leaf Lake has Stanford Sierra Camp. I used to go there as a kid. It's great. Um, and you can see in the bottom the burn footprint of a fire called the Caldor Fire that burned in 2021. It burned from the western slope of the Sierra all the way across to the east side. It was one of two fires that did that year. The Dixie Fire was the other one. And then right in the middle of the frame, there's kind of a line of gray, the houses are sort of highlighted in white. And you can see that there's this narrow strip of houses that pass right through the fire. It's like there's a break in the fire. And I should say the fire burned on this image from left to right. What's that strip? That strip is Christmas Valley. There was a fire in South Lake Tahoe in the early 2000s called the Angora Fire that put the fear of God in everyone in South Lake. They lost 240 homes in an afternoon, a couple of hours, under dangerous fire weather conditions. And they said, we can do better. And they did. They did the work. And that work paid off handsomely when the Caldor Fire came to town. The Caldor Fire burned at high severity and high intensity over the summit, the Echo Summit, and was essentially showering embers onto Christmas Valley, which is that narrow strip of land in the image. Not a single structure was lost. The reason is that firefighters were able to remain in the community and be safe, putting out spot fires as they were ignited by the embers. Why was that? Because the community had done the work to reduce fuels in people's backyards and in the community and had constructed fuel breaks against the wildlands so that the flame links dropped as the fire came down the hill from Echo Summit. Flame links went from 20 to 3 feet at the edge of the community, and the embers were not encountering enough fuel to really start large spot fires within the community. Zero structures were lost. Everybody got to go home. No one's children's school burned down, right, in this fire. And that, I think, is a huge success. There's another community on the other side of this fire called Grizzly Flats, where Unfortunately, the Forest Service was not able to do certain things that they needed to do on their end, and the entire community was lost, except for one house. The Firewise directors, the head of the Firewise community's home survived the fire. But like, you don't want to be that one house, right? I mean, I think he has been very troubled by the idea of continuing to live in the place that he loved that now is gone. And so I think Christmas Ballet really stands as an example of what is possible if the entire community bands together to do the work. And I'll just say also, and this is somewhat similar to the South Bay, this was an all hands, all lands effort. There is an enormous complexity of land ownership in the South Lake Tahoe region, including the federal and state governments, and everybody banded together to do this work to create this kind of a success. As we think about what we can do about it, we have to start with our homes. And I think that's, a key message from that image of burning houses in Altadena is that community resilience starts at the house and goes out from there. This is a picture of what people call the Miracle House of Lahaina, a home that survived very intense ember attack and high intensity fire. You can see what happened to all of the homes in the neighborhood around it during the Lahaina fire. Why did it survive? Well, it had a metal roof, which was, very helpful. But probably more important than that, it had a well-prepared garden. In particular, this house had had termite issues prior to the fire. The house had been bagged and sprayed for termites. And then this is kind of a native Hawaiian thing, I guess, is that if you put lava rock around the house, the termites can't cross the lava rock. And so they won't re-enter from the surrounding environment once the house is cleaned of termites. So this house had about 5 feet of lava rock spread around the foundation to keep those termites out. That lava rock basically created what firefighters like to call zone zero, which is an area around the house free of combustible material. And that was incredibly important in increasing the odds of survival. Now, of course, there's no guarantees in a fire. This is more like putting your seatbelt on in a car. If you're wearing your seatbelt, you're very likely to survive an accident on Junipero Serra. If you get into an accident on 280 going 65 or 70 miles an hour, even with your seatbelt on and all your airbags and crumple zones, you might not survive, right? So there's no guarantees, but what you can do is change the odds. And if everybody does this, there are kind of community level effects that are very significant. Just show you another example of a home that had some unique features that really led to we think led to its survival. This is a home from the Palisades. It's gotten a lot of press. And important things to note here are that the home actually doesn't have an attic, but is well prepared in terms of vents so that embers could not enter the structure. This home also has a feature that I think needs greater consideration after Los Angeles. Notice that it has hard walls around the structure rather than like a hedge, which is very common in LA. You see these 20 to 30 foot tall hedges to create privacy screens. Um, the Institute for Building Home Safety after action work in LA has just shown that any kind of a wall, stucco wall, just in this case, it was sort of a modernist cement wall, but not very tall, kind of mimicking a picket fence, can really create a barrier to embers that are the key source of ignition in these urban firestorms. Um, so as we move out from the house, as we think about what a well-prepared home for wildfire should look like, this is an example of a home in San Rafael in Marin County. What you can see is that, vegetation is really different than we're used to thinking of in many parts of Northern California. And I think this is what we can do about it, but this is also the hard thing. And I want to be honest about that, right? This home has has a yard. It's quite different than yards we might often observe. And I'll just say, I think this is not the only way to do this. But this home is going to resist ember ignition in a number of different ways. It's a typical Eichler that we'd see in the South Bay too. But the most important piece of this is that you're not going to have a garden that's going to ignite, and then as embers land on the garden, that then is going to ignite the structure. And if you watch, there are a number of interesting videos you can watch of Pacific Palisades as it was burning. And this is exactly the style of ignition that was most important in LA, and that I think we need to think about as we prepare communities. Um, this is another. This is from Firewise Marin's garden page, and you can see that Firewise gardens don't have to be ugly. They don't have to be desert-like. They can be lush. They need to be well maintained. There needs to be real attention paid to the amount of fuel in a garden. Um, Also, attention paid to creating non-combustible kind of landscaping features like these stone walkways that create barriers, and especially barriers around the structure. This isn't a picture of a structure, but you can see that this gardener is thinking about how to create a beautiful landscape where their kids can play, where they can entertain, but also that will not shower their home with embers when the garden is receiving firebrands and embers from a fire, either in a neighboring parcel or neighboring parcels, or from wildlands that are adjacent. Um, Moving away from the house, there are other things that we can do at the community level that can be incredibly effective. There was actually, this is, I'm sorry, I need to change this. This is I think the line fire, not the bridge fire. But the line fire was a fire that burned in outside of LA in the San Gabriel Mountains this past summer, and it's shown in red. The community, you can see the community of Angeles Oaks there, the street grid there. It's the Angeles Oaks sits up on a ridge above the canyon in which the line fire was burning at high intensity. The winds were aligned with the terrain at the time of this fire, which made it extremely dangerous. It was burning up the canyon toward Bear Valley. Luckily, it didn't get to Bear Valley, but it burned up the walls of the canyon where it encountered a prescribed fire that has, and this mapping is from Watch Duty, which is an excellent app. I'd highly recommend that everyone, if they don't already have it, download it to their phones. But what you can see is that the wildfire in red hit the prescribed fire in gray, that understory burn, and just stopped. There is any wildland firefighter, the first thing they learn is that there is safety in the black, right? If you want to be safe in a fire, you go where there is no fuel because the fuel has already burned. If you want to create a safe community from an advancing wildfire, one thing you can do is burn around the community. That sounds like it might create something that's ugly. It is not ugly. It's actually can be quite beautiful, can open up a park-like um, environment around a community that is it's really different than what most people in Northern California have experienced, but is because of fire exclusion, right? Because we haven't allowed fire in and around communities, but it can create safety, and you see here success. Angeles Oaks lost no structures in this fire. Without this prescribed fire that had occurred prior, it's pretty clear that the fire would have burned right up to that ridgetop, and all the houses sitting on the top of that ridgetop with the nice views would have been exposed to a lot of heat and a lot of flame, and probably would have been lost. Um, There are ways to make it easier to do these kinds of prescribed fires. This is a picture of the burn bot operating on the dish. The burn bot is a way to sort of create containment lines for prescribed fire very safely. One thing you want to make sure is that your prescribed fire doesn't escape prescription and cause harm to the community or resources within the community. There are technologies that are being developed that make it easier and safer to do that. And I think we need to be looking for ways to increase the productivity of some of these activities that are going to create community resilience. There are also very important ecosystem benefits to restoring fire to landscapes. And this just shows one example of that. In the background, this is from the Bootleg Fire, a big fire up in Oregon in 2021. In the background, you can see an area that received no treatment. In the foreground, an area that received some commercial thinning. And in the middle, thinning plus prescribed fire. The forest was thinned, and then a broadcast burn was conducted under the canopy. And what you can see is when the Bootleg Fire burned through, burning from left to right on this image, the difference in outcomes across different levels of treatment. And I personally think, I want to have a forested landscape in Northern California and in the Sierra. And an important way to maintain that in the face of the growing risk from high intensity fire is to actually engage in prescribe the activities that are necessary to return fire safely to the ground in the areas that we care about. And certainly the mountains above the peninsula are an important area where we need to be thinking more about how to do this and creating outcomes at scale, both around communities and in the areas for recreation and environmental reasons that we care the most about. Um, so, what are the barriers? One of the barriers, I think, is really community acceptance, and I think we need to be honest about this. Um, this is just a picture of two or sort of a side by side in a wind tunnel that the insurance industry nonprofit IBHS has in North Carolina of what an unhardened house and a hardened house does when exposed to flying embers. And you can see that the unhardened house is burning down. It's about to totally ignite. You can see that there's flames under the eaves, that the mulch that was placed right up against the foundation has ignited the siding of the house. And that's going to be a total loss, right? And that's just reality. But there are lots of things that we can do to reduce the chances of that. We can screen the vents properly. We can close the eaves. We can do very simple things like not have mulch, combustible mulch, right up to the foundation of the house. Even better, and I think this is coming in California, but it's going to take a while, is we can create a zone zero, a non-combustible area that is attractive and beautiful, but also safe around the structure. Governor Newsom, in response to the wildfires in January, announced that a zone zero regulation will be finalized in California by the end of this year. That's going to make it mandatory for new construction that this non-combustible zone be created, but there'll be a 3-year delay in the implementation of the rule for existing structures. I frankly think that the most important thing that any community can do to accelerate wildfire resilience for the community is to do early implementation of zone zero. That is, there is nothing more important. Talk to any firefighter who has experienced these kind of urban conflagrations, and I think I at least encounter unanimity about that as an effective strategy. At the same time, there's real concern about community pushback and resistance to this idea of, and firefighters tend to talk about it in terms of like, um, hardening to ember attack. Really, what we're talking about here is changing gardens. And I think, the best thing that Los Altos could do, if in my opinion, would be to emerge as a leader on the peninsula for creation of these kinds of features in gardens, and also as a source of imagery and examples of what a beautiful fire-safe garden looks like. Separately, this is just a picture of some of a prescribed burn association conducting a prescribed fire with a school field trip invited to the prescribed fire. I think there's a real education component to what we need to do in terms of explaining our landscape and what our relationship to fire needs to be, and that relationship needs to change from one that has focused on fire exclusion to one that focuses on accepting fire as a natural component of what shapes our ecosystems so that we can manage it in a way that is safer. Fire exclusion is not working. We're never going to have enough fire trucks to fight the kind of fires that occurred in LA. Aircraft are useless on the days that matter most. None of the aircraft could fly. LA has its own Air Force, firefighting Air Force, one of the most capable firefighting aviation fleets in the world. And it was powerless to help on January 7th because the winds were so intense that the aircraft could not fly. Even if the aircraft could have flown, fire retardant is useless under those kinds of wind conditions. And so, there's the idea that we're going to suppress our way out of these kinds of situations, I think is unrealistic. We will be able to suppress, we'll be successful at fighting the fires that probably we should allow as much space as is safe to consume fuel in and around communities. we will be unsuccessful at suppressing the fires that are the most dangerous, the most likely to lead to loss of life and loss of communities. Thanks, and I'm happy to take questions.
Michael, thank you so much. That was super compelling, and I'm sitting here having recently, re-landscaped our house, and thinking that the topic of fire never came up in the conversation at all with the landscape designer or the landscape crew. And I'm glad that the mulch that we put in all over the place, which I now think of as fuel, based on this conversation today, maybe we need to do some rocks or something different.
Yeah, Joe,
So
could
go
actually
ahead.
let me say just quickly one thing. I'm going to put something in the chat. There was a documentary that came out 2 days ago by a great team. It's the first documentary about the LA wildfires. You can watch it for free on PBS, and I'd highly recommend if people are interested and haven't seen this, that they check it out. The other thing is we had the same problem when we moved into a home. It was not well landscaped, and we put river rocks around the base of our foundation to create zone zero. And it can be attractive. It doesn't have to be ugly. It doesn't have to be just like dumping gravel around your house, right? And none of us want to do that. Um, but you can create beautiful landscapes that are also safe.
Great. And I'm noticing in the chat people are DMing me some questions. So Cynthia, you might just want to raise your hand, and we'll get to the questions in a moment. Michael, hopefully you can go a little past 9:30, because I think we're gonna have a lot of
Okay.
questions. How's your schedule?
I have a 9:30, but I'm happy to just be a little bit late to that.
Okay, maybe we'll go 5 minutes if you don't mind.
Sure.
So I think you answered most of the questions I had prepared, but I'd really like your honest assessment if Los Altos and the surrounding area are prepared for what's to come. I think, you kind of hinted at the answer might be no, but what's your honest assessment?
Look, it's not just Los Altos. California as a whole is not prepared. And we need to do a lot more. We need to do a lot more, and insurance, is one reason to do it. Sort of, it's a signal. I don't think it can be the cause. Like we don't want to allow the insurance market to deteriorate to the point where there's actually financial incentives to do this, because the financial incentives will be things like your insurance cost being $70,000 a year. Um, so what we want to see is that this activity can happen before, and that's as important because like I mentioned, the human tragedy in these fires is so immense. There's the loss of life, but even the people that do survive, and I should say, like LA County did an incredible job evacuating people. I am astonished that only 17 people died in Altadena. That was a remarkable achievement. Um, the but the people that survive are traumatized to a person, and we want to avoid that. We don't want to traumatize kids who experience this.
Yep.
And so there's so many reasons to do more. And I guess but it does mean change. It does mean sometimes loss of some privacy with neighbors, especially where you've got small side yards. Um, but that is a price that I think everyone should be willing to pay at this point to avoid outcomes like Pacific Palisades and Altadena. And
Yep.
Los Altos Hills, I'll just say another, Los Altos Hills jumps out of catastrophe models. I've used one of the models that is relied on by insurance companies to set rates that evaluates the risk and the potential for losses in these kind of high intensity single burn period fires, where the fire burns for 8 to 10 hours and it's basically over at that point. But it's things like Oakland Hills, right? And Los Altos Hills is right in there with the places in California that are the most dangerous, like Pacific Palisades and Orinda, as a place where a major event could occur. So we should be worried about this and taking action.
Great. And I have a friend down in Palisades who was one of the lucky ones whose house survived, but they're surrounded by a graveyard of dead houses, right? And they're still going to be out of their house for a year or two because of all the smoke damage and having to gut it, essentially. So um, I think it's more of a community thing. Each of us has to act individually, but if we don't all do it together, it kind of doesn't matter what happens to your specific house, right?
That's absolutely true.
Yeah. You mentioned this term zone zero, which I was not familiar with. Maybe everyone else is, but can you just spend a minute on exactly what that is? I got from the context, I think, what it is, but there'll be lots of residents who aren't familiar with this stuff watching this after the fact. Tell us more about zone zero.
Zone zero is so for a long time, firefighters have had two kind of regions that they consider for defensible space. Zone one and zone two. Zone one is within 30 feet of the structure, zone two is within 100 feet. Honestly, the science does not support that management of fuels in now those regions is super effective. It's maybe effective in the area within 30 feet of a house, but the the evidence from Paradise and Santa Rosa and the other major loss experiences of the last decade really shows that what is within 5 feet of the structure is what matters in these urban fires. And the reason is that the ignition of homes happens via embers, right? So if you go and if you look at movies of these, what these fires look like, there's just like flaming debris, like little pieces of fire moving through the air, like a snowstorm of fire. And the snowstorm hits houses, hits a vertical structure, and then falls down to the base. Whatever's at the base is ignited by those embers. If there's not anything to ignite, the ember lands on the non-burnable material and burns out, and then the house is fine. But if there's like a rose bush or some kind of a hedge or plant that was put there many years ago and has grown up and gotten really mature, that's the thing that's gonna light the house on fire. Or if there's a wood pile, or
Wood
if there
wood
is
chips, would
or
mulch and wood
mulch.
chips.
Mulch is and especially gorilla hair mulch, like the kind of finer mulch.
Oh yeah,
Um, that stuff is super dangerous. And so that's where you really want to think about, moving that kind of material away. A lot of what private firefighters do, people don't know this either. A lot of what private firefighters do when they're prepping structures as a wildfire is approaching is they create this environment around the structure in a hurry on an emergency basis with chainsaws. So they'll show up at your yard. And I should have said another big risk factor that's in this kind of zone zero that people don't think about is wood fences. So like if you have a wood fence that's attached to your house, embers will blow in, hit the wood fence, fall down to the base, and then the fence will ignite and then burn into your house, right? Like a wick or a fuse. Um, and so changing out your side yard gate for say a metal gate can be an incredibly effective strategy for reducing the chances that your home ignites. So
excellent.
regulation around that is coming, but it's going to be a long time. And frankly, we don't have time. Like every year, we're taking a chance in communities with high fire risk around these issues that we don't take action.
Got it. My last question for you is, what are the most cost-effective upgrades we homeowners can do to reduce the fire risk? I think you just covered a few of them, but what would you suggest?
I mean, the place to start is the building envelope and very low cost things that will reduce the chance that those embers, that burning snowstorm, will get into your house. Because the way homes ignite typically is that fire gets inside the house and then it burns from the inside out. And so screening your vents with fine mesh is really important, really important. Because the attic vents are a key way that fire gets into homes. That's a pretty low cost intervention. Another one that can be important is keeping your gutters clean and screening your gutters, right? So that you don't have a bunch of material in your gutter that can ignite your roof. And then I think the next step is creating this landscape around in your yard, right? It's gardening. And gardening is, can be expensive, but especially if we're just talking about the 5 feet around your house, it doesn't have to be super expensive to create an environment around your house that is not conducive to igniting the home.
Excellent. Did you want to say something else?
No, it's okay. I mean, there's a laundry list, but those are the cheap things, and I think we need to focus on doing the things that are not too expensive first. As you remodel a house, there's more you could do. Like windows can be important, siding can be important, but that's all much more expensive and time consuming. So I think it's just important to focus on what we can do now. Like what could you do this year
Yep.
to get ready for August?
Sounds good. All right. Well, Thank you so much. Really compelling presentation and a little scary, but I think important conversation to have. We're going to open it up. As I mentioned, please raise your virtual hand. I'll call on you. One question per person and no speeches, please. Ed, take it away.
Yeah, thanks just very much for covering that territory you covered. We've found that people in our neighborhood, as we started to discuss, haven't included the need to remove shake roofs, cedar shake roofs, as a major risk factor that has not been appreciated down here in the Bay Area. I happen to have a house up in South Lake Tahoe, so and I bought it 15 years ago, so fully aware of the things that had to be pulled off a house, like a shake roof, in order to really make the house, the envelope, safe. All I'm saying is the shake roof is like even before the gutters and
Your question, Ed, please.
yes. And the question is, do you agree that a shake roof is it?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't mention that, Ed, because my assumption is those don't exist anymore. I mean, in high hazard areas for quite a while, since '08, I believe, you
Yeah.
have not been allowed to put cedar on a roof.
The whole Ladera shopper is shake roofs along Alpine Road. If you look at it, people don't look at it and don't see it.
Okay. Yeah, that's I mean, I would definitely, replacing cedar roofing. You should not, I mean, I would say this actually for roofing and siding. If you get to the point where you're doing any work like that, you want to y- you want to reshingle in something that will not combust, and that applies to roofing and siding.
Yeah.
Roofing is obviously much worse because then you've got a surface that embers can land on and ignite. Um, but siding's important too. We need to move away from putting like lining the surface of our homes with what is effectively kindling.
Thank you, Ed. Yeah, Rancho just redid their roof, portions of their roof, and you can just see the stark contrast of the new wood that now looks like something to burn. Gary, your question, please. You need to unmute. There you go.
We love our urban tree canopy, Michael. And so, what can we do to make sure we don't lose all of our trees? It sounds pretty draconian what you're and kind of the direction you're headed. And so, I'm worried about that. I mean, trees, after all, do keep the area cooler in the summer, and that helps with this vapor deficit that you described.
So I want to push back a little bit there, Gary. The vapor pressure deficit is a function of the larger atmosphere. Trees are not going to help.
Okay.
They will keep the environment in the community a little bit cooler.
Yeah, 7 degrees or so.
The What I'd say is that I think it is possible to have well-maintained trees, especially large trees. You do need to create spacing. Um, but that is possible if you do the work in and around structures and prepare structures. And you might think of this as like a valuable trade-off, right? That in order to maintain some of that more of that urban tree canopy, and I don't this is not I'm not suggesting that we need to, and this has actually been an important point of conversation in a zone zero regulatory discussion. Is like, can we have big trees? If you look at fires like the Camp Fire that burned in mixed conifer environments, the trees survive. The houses are what's gone. And
I noticed that.
and so I think that's telling you something important, right? And that that trees can certainly be a problem if they're not maintained in a safe way. If you've got dead trees, if you've got tree canopy that's like touching a house, right? There are things that need to be done that maybe aren't always done. I mean, I look around my neighborhood in Mill Valley, and they're certainly not done around here. Um, but you can have healthy trees. The one thing I would note is that the kind of tree density and fuel density that we have as a function of our of that we have now is in large part a function of fire exclusion, right? This is not natural. Like the tree density that we have on the peninsula at this point is something that is a product of excluding fire and especially extirpating Native Americans from the landscape. The fire frequency on the peninsula was like, especially as you move up the hill, was about once every 5 to 10 years prior to the 1850s. And that change is a big part of what's creating risk, especially as you move uphill in this environment.
Hmm. Interesting point. Thank you.
We should strive to have gigantic mature oaks
Yep.
spacing in between them. And it's the baby trees that are the problem.
Okay.
Great. I think we have two more questions. Cynthia, go ahead.
Yeah. Um, Thank you. You may have hinted at the answer to my question in your last comment. But I was wondering about what's the recommended frequency of prescribed burning, because of course you burn and it grows back.
Sure.
And particularly when you have often the lands are either publicly owned or owned by nonprofit organizations. Well, resources are pretty thin. They're not going to come through every 2 years to suppress it. So I'm curious about that.
Yeah. Well, we've done research to understand uh, the the kind of treatment, the duration of the treatment effect of prescribed fire. So what prescribed fire does is reduce the chance of high intensity fire in a forested environment, especially or a grassland. Um, and our research, at least, and this is looking at kind of all of California, not necessarily the specifics of the peninsula. And there's a lot of individual context, and I would emphasize that. Like, there's no one answer for this, but in mixed conifer forests and oak woodlands in California, in the mixed conifer, we observed a treatment effect, sort of protection from high intensity fire that lasted about 8 to 10 years. So that would imply that you'd want to be burning about that often in order to really, and this is to cut the chance of high intensity fire by about 2/3. Um, there's no guarantees. Again, this is seatbelts. This isn't total safety. In oak woodlands, the treatment effect was shorter, more on the order of 5 years, because you've got grass under the oaks, and so you've got fuel. There's much more light, and so you get fuel growing back much faster. Um, that's really tough. I mean, I just want to acknowledge, like, for a land trust or a park or any arm of government to be able to afford that is really hard right now. And Stanford we have a lot of resources to spend on fuels management, and we're probably not going to achieve that level. Certainly not with fire. Um, and so this is about, and part of the reason things are so hard and so expensive now is that the we've got so much fuel accumulation that it's really hard to put fire back on the landscape. You have to do a lot of pile burning before you could even consider doing a broadcast burn safely, particularly if you're close to the built environment. And so there's a ton of work to kind of get us out of the hole that we're in terms of fuel accumulation over the past 150 years. That's a place where we need to focus. And I would argue it's a place where we should be thinking about focusing, especially adjacent to communities. One of the things, there was very dense, what folks call decadent chaparral adjacent to the communities that burned in Los Angeles. And what that meant was when there was ignition in that area just adjacent to the community, both ignitions were pretty close to houses. Um, there was a rapid buildup of heat. And the basic pattern of these urban firestorms that are ignited by wildfires is that there's enough heat coming off the wildlands to ignite 10 to 15 houses at once. And once you have 10 to 15 structures go up, you've kind of lost the battle from a firefighting perspective. It's very difficult for fire suppression resources to catch up with the ignitions once you have those multiple ignitions that then themselves then ignite more houses. And there's kind of a chain reaction. And so one strategy on the wildlands is to really focus the attention about fuels reduction in that sort of half-mile to mile area adjacent to where a lot of homes are.
Great. And I think we only have time for one more. Martha, go ahead with your question.
Hi. As someone who lived through the 1985 Arastradero Liticote fire, and I had almost a front row seat to that, Los Altos Hills has a philosophy of, okay, what I meant to say was I've seen firsthand how fast fires can spread, especially in the hills and going uphill. And our community in Los Altos Hills has a philosophy of protecting open space areas. And several of our properties have conservation easements, which prevent residents from doing anything in that particular part of the property. And sometimes those properties are adjacent to each other. So we might have six to eight properties sharing small forests, typically on the leeward side of the hill. And these are native forests, they're buckeyes, they're oaks. And there's really no way to do prescribed burns in residential neighborhoods. But if a fire gets into that area and burns, there could be 20 or 40 houses burned to the ground if it spreads. So do you have any recommendation for how residents can deal or work with the towns to try to reduce fire load in those open space easements?
Yeah. So first of all, you know, a conservation easement, I think the question would be to read the easement itself. Many conservation easements have, this is a public safety issue. The local government has police power in that context. And I think the question would be how to interpret the easement. I would not agree with the assertion that fire is an unnatural thing in wildlands in these areas, and that it couldn't be interpreted, reintroduction of fire or reintroduction of some kind of form of fuels management couldn't be interpreted as consistent with the easement. It's gonna mean reinterpreting what that easement means and getting consensus around that. Um, I guess I would say I think it is not crazy to think about systematically evaluating that question. It was an issue in legislation back in 2018, SB 901. It was eventually stripped out of the bill because probably for some of the reasons that I think were alluded to by Cynthia in her question, that the expense of requiring land trusts to maintain fuels on the lands that they manage would have kind of overwhelmed the resources of the land trusts. But that doesn't mean it's not the right thing to do. And if there are resources, I think that the conservation easements should not be a barrier, because no one is served by the values that are conserved are not served by the loss of the property in a high intensity fire, right? The loss of the ecosystem in a high intensity fire. Mineralized soil, which is the outcome of high intensity fire, is not a benefit to the easement and is not in the interests of the values that are intended to be conserved. And so we need to be looking at some of these legal agreements that were, made without really knowing or thinking about this issue. And that kind of problem comes up in law all the time, right? You have a contract or a trust or something that was created without considering some new fact pattern that would develop. And then you look at the document and you say, how should we interpret it in light of this new situation? And that is something that happens in law all the time. And this is one of those times, I would argue, where we need to really be thinking about what does it mean to conserve natural lands and working lands. This is also applicable in the, kind of agricultural land trust context as well. And I think it does not mean doing nothing, because if doing nothing is unnatural in the context of the peninsula, the natural context involved people called Miwoks that were burning the land, right? And we didn't understand that fully when a lot of the conservation easement movement got started in the 70s, but we do now, and it's not too late. And we can save these places and save these kind of patches of forested land, not necessarily from broadcast burning right away, but certainly using pile burns in ways to create much greater landscape resilience, also resistance to pests and drought, um, and safety for the communities.
Michael, I know you had a meeting at 9:30, so thank you so much. I'm going to let you drop. Fred, we'll try to get your question to
Perfect.
Michael. If you can email us, I'll give you the email address in a second. But thank you so much for your time today, Michael.
Have a great day, everyone. Thank
And
you.
thank you. And just a few announcements. I'm sorry, guys, we couldn't get to all the questions. There was a lot of content there. We do not currently have a meeting planned for April 4th, but obviously a lot of interest in this fire topic. So we're still working on if we can pull something together. Our next planned meeting is for Friday, April 18th at 8:30. Please join us for a discussion entitled Federal Budget Threats to Local Public Safety, Health, and Education with Margaret Abe Koga, Santa Clara County Supervisor, Jessica Spicer, Santa Clara County Board of Education, and Pete Daly, Los Altos Mayor. If you'd like to be added to the LACC mailing list, or Fred, in your case, we'll try to get your question to Michael and get a response. Please email info@losaltoscommunitycoalition.org. The email should be posted in chat. I'm sorry I couldn't get to everything in the chat, but we'll capture that and hopefully get through for some of the comments that came in. And really important topic for our community. And I know there's already been some efforts through the Community Foundation and many others in the fire districts. So we'll obviously there's a lot of interest in this topic and some things we can all do together. So we'll continue to promote this as much as we can. Huge thank you as always to the LAMVCF for providing LACC with financial and in-kind support. And thank you once again. We'll see you in either 2 weeks or 4 weeks, depending on how things go. Thank you all very much.